Welcome to the Shepherd Peace Counseling Ministries. I'm Nathan Clark, and here today on our series, Questions and Answers, we are going to be looking at polygamy. We're going to look at the question, does God support polygamy? If we read our Bibles and we take the verses that talk about marriage in the area of how many people are supposed to be in it, we might get the idea that God's divided on this subject. But we know that God isn't a God of confusion. So there has to be an answer. We have to come to an understanding why there seems that God's saying that there's only one man and one woman. And then on the other hand, it seems that he's supporting multiple wives. So let's look in our Bible here today. We're gonna look at both sides, and then we're gonna try to lay it out and see if we can't come to a reasonable understanding, if nothing else, my understanding of why it seems that the Bible is divided on this. Because I do not believe the Bible is divided on this. I do believe there is a good answer for this. We just need to take a little time to think it through. So let's start in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, where God lays the foundation right at creation. He's laying the foundation for what he wants marriage to be. Genesis 2, verse 24. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. So we see we have a man and a woman coming together to make one union, the union of marriage. Then we have a confirmation of this by Jesus himself multiple times in the Synoptic Gospels. But we'll just look at Matthew chapter 19, and we'll jump in at verse 4. And he answered and said unto them, speaking to the Pharisees, Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. So we see Jesus is simply quoting the verses there in Genesis chapter 2. And he says that there's two of them. Not three, not four, not five, just two. A man and a woman, and they two shall become one flesh, the union of marriage. So we see again that Jesus himself is supporting the idea that there's only two people in this marriage. And then we have, even in Deuteronomy, this is in the law books, in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17, we see a law given to those who are going to be chosen to be rulers over Israel, the kings. And it says here, neither, we're in Deuteronomy 17:17. Neither shall he multiply, that being the kings, or the rulers, multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away, neither shall he be greedy, multiplying himself silver and gold. So we see there that he's not to have multiple wives. The evidence is starting to build up here that God's kind of against more than two people in this marriage. And then if we turn to 1 Corinthians, Paul gives a little insight on this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we'll begin at verse number 2. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. It really doesn't get any clearer than this. One husband, one wife. His own wife. This is singular. It doesn't say let every man have his own wives. And it doesn't say let every woman have her own husbands. Singular. One wife, one husband. We could go several other places. If we go to 1 Timothy chapter 3, we'll find in verse 2, when it's speaking of the priests are to have only one wife. The deacons in verse number 12, to have one wife. Again, if we go to Titus chapter 1, verse 6, we see that the elders are to only have one wife. When Paul went into Greece and was trying to establish his church, polygamy was a big issue that he ran into up there in Macedonia. And so getting these church members, these leaders, to understand that you have to be an example for the people. And that starts in your marriage. And he emphasizes that a lot in 1 Timothy and in Titus, the condition of their marriage. And that also includes not having a polygamous relationship, but you are to be a husband of only one wife. So we see that the evidence in the Bible is really strong at this point that God is against polygamy. But there are some verses in the Bible, in the books of the law, that support this. If we turn to Exodus for our first reference. Now, as far as I can find, there's really only 2 references in support of polygamy in the law books. There's lots of references to polygamy in the books of history, but we need not to confuse history with God's law. The Bible records a lot of things that happens that aren't necessarily good, and definitely not God's will, but he records it nonetheless. We shouldn't just assume that because, Jacob had many wives, that automatically means God loved Jacob, God used Jacob in a big way, automatically meaning that he supports polygamy. That's not true. It happened, and God still used Jacob, and he still used those multiple wives, but that doesn't mean that was his way. That doesn't mean that was the way he desired. He can take a fallen situation and use it for good. We see that very story with Joseph. He took the difficult situation that Joseph was in, and he used it for good. But it doesn't mean that was his law. He's not quoting law in history. He's just showing us what's happening. And a lot of times we can see the difficulties that come from that. And you don't have to look very, very closely at Jacob's relationship with his wives to see that it was not a healthy, that was a dysfunctional household, to say the least. He was not blessed with his multiple wives. His marital relationship was not a good one. But nonetheless, God used it for good. But here in the law books, in Exodus, we're going to start here in Exodus chapter 21. And we're reading starting verse 10. We're going to see some provisions made for a polygamous relationship. And if he take him another wife, her food, her raiment, her duty of marriage shall not diminish. And if he do not these 3 unto her, then shall she go out free without money. So here's what he's saying, and this is actually referring to a servitude, a slave type marriage relationship. So here we have a man who's got more than one wife, and this particular wife has been purchased. He's saying that he has 3 things that he has to do, not only for his new wife, but it's for his old wife, but everyone involved. He has to be able to maintain this certain level of responsibility with all the wives involved, and that is that they have raiment, and that they're to have duties of marriage, and they're to have food. And if he fails to do any of these, she can walk away from the relationship without having to pay her way out. All right, so this does seem that God it's not a seem, he does. He's made provisions for this polygamous relationship. Then if we turn to Deuteronomy chapter 21, we'll jump in verse 15, we see another one. It says, if a man have 2 wives, one beloved, another hated, and they have borne him children, both the beloved and the hated, and if the firstborn son be hers that was hated, then it shall be, well, we could read on and on. What we're going to see here is that if you have multiple wives, then he's making provisions. What will happen to the sons? How is the inheritance going to be broken down? For the hated one versus the unhated one. Does it automatically mean that the loved one, that their son's going to be the one that gets it's making provisions to make sure that there's a fair and lawful condition under this polygamous relationship. Now, so the question is we have some verses that seem to support polygamy, and many verses, I'd say the majority of them, seem to be against polygamy. But how do we explain those verses that are for polygamy? Well, let's look at polygamy in history. If we go back to Abraham, which we'll say is the father of Israel, I mean, he's the father of Isaac, and then Isaac to Jacob, and then Jacob the father of the children of Israel, we're going to start with Abraham. Abraham came out of the Babylonian culture. He came to Canaan, but he brought with him that culture. Now, most of us are probably familiar with Hammurabi. He's known for his Hammurabi, the law of Hammurabi. Abraham preceded Hammurabi by several hundred years. But we know what happened. We understand the culture of the Babylonian area from Hammurabi. He gives us an insight of just how they thought and what they thought were important, what they thought was wrong, and what they thought was right. Hammurabi was influenced greatly by his predecessors. Even though he set the code, even though he's known for the code of Hammurabi, we can learn a lot from his law. And polygamy was in that. And so from that, we can see that Abraham was probably in, we'll say, the society aspect of his life, that he was highly influenced by the culture. And that his culture, the culture that he came from, remember, God had been lost since the flood. This is nearly 1,000 years later, and the culture has lost God. And Abraham, only through a divine intervention, did he become aware of God and get to know our Heavenly Father. But he still had that culture with him. So Abraham brought out of Babylon into Canaan this culture of polygamy. And then, of course, he passed that on down to his son, and then his son, down to his son. And then, of course, we see in the story of Jacob and Esau, right off the bat, goes and gets many wives. So we can see that Esau, he didn't really think there was anything wrong with it initially. And then Jacob, of course, he's sent back to where his mother came from, back into that area where Abraham came from, there in Babylon. And there, too, he took on this polygamous relationship with Leah and Rachel. And then he brings that back, and then we can see that after that they go into Egypt. And Egypt was highly influenced by polygamy. Polygamy was a normal part of their culture. And there the children of Israel lived for 400 years in that society that was pro-polygamy. And they really had little to lean on as far as understanding what God's will was done. They understood a little bit of what God. A little bit was carried down from Noah to Abraham and so forth. But a lot of it was lost. And so polygamy, the ideal marriage, apparently seems to be lost. So here we are in history. The children of Israel are exiting out of Egypt, and there they are in the Sinai wilderness, and a law is given to them. Now, I don't believe this is a brand new law. I believe that God's reestablishing the old law that he established with Adam. But whichever way it is, a law that they were not familiar with is now being placed upon them. And I think that it's clear that the law that is being placed upon them is one man and one woman. Yet there still seems to be provisions for a polygamy relationship. So how do we work through that? Well, imagine, if you will, let's take an imaginary walk. Imagine it in 2018, our legislative government passes a law that says that internal combustion engines are no longer to be manufactured in this country. Our cars are no longer to run on gas, but we're now to only operate with electric motors. Yet if we were to go, let's say, 1,000 years into the future, and our ancestors were to do a research on 2018, trying to get to know their history a little bit, and then looking through the law books and go, 2018, they did away with combustion engines. They really took a step towards the green side. But yet they keep looking through the law books and they see that on the law books for another 100 years is laws on how to manage emissions, laws on how to manage fossil fuels. And so they're confused. They're looking here going, why is there still laws to manage fuel? Why is there still law to manage the emissions on these internal combustion engines if they passed a law and made it illegal to manufacture them? Well, here's why. There are millions of internal combustion cars running on the streets today. It would be economically impossible for the government to simply come in and say, you turn in your old car and we'll give you a new one. They can't afford to do that. And society would implode if every household was to have to get rid of their car and they couldn't afford to buy another car. And so then they would not be able to go to work. They wouldn't be able to travel. They wouldn't be able to do anything that the dependence on that car initiates the need for a slow easing into the new found no internal combustion engine law. So obviously we're not just going to automatically get rid of all the cars that run on gasoline. It's going to take a process. But every gasoline car that dies has to be replaced by electric motor. And over time, eventually all those cars will be filtered out and all the new cars will be ushered in. I think that we can look at what's happening here in this Mosaic law that way. Is that here we have all these families coming out of Egypt that have multiple wives and children from multiple wives. Polygamy was a huge part that had onset into their culture in a way that just you couldn't just simply go in and say, okay, you're going to have to get rid of your wives, except for one. Well, which one do I keep? What about the children? How do I work out the children? It couldn't be done. And I believe God recognized that. And so he set some provisions to help manage the polygamy relationships that were already existing when they came out of Egypt, until those relationships, we say, die off. And then the new relationships that are built under God's law, one man and one woman, then begin to take over. Now, Israel didn't do a real good job in carrying that on. Polygamy ended up back into their culture again. We can see that there with Solomon and many other instances. But again, that's history. That does not mean that God promotes it. I believe the reason that we see these, as far as I can tell, these only two statutes that give provisions of how to handle a polygamous relationship is because polygamy was already part of the culture, and God was just giving them a way to manage that until polygamy was flushed out in God's new and perfect way of one man and one woman took over. Well, those are my thoughts here today, and I hope they were helpful for you. And I want to continue to encourage everyone to be reading their Bible and to search and find these questions and find a way to get them answered. And if you have a question here for Shepherd Peace Counseling Ministries, please do not hesitate to email us at the email address found at the end of this show. May God bless and have a wonderful day.